Hello, DawgNation. I'm Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We are go for 2 in 22 and getting ready for clean, old-fashioned hate on Saturday. Busy show for us. Before we're done, we'll welcome in the former Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm to the show today. We'll talk to him about what the Tech rivalry means to him and players who played at Georgia over the years. I think that'll be interesting. Connor Riley stops by. He'll help us preview the newest release of the College Football Playoff Top 25, which comes out tonight. We'll also take a brief look back to him to the win for Georgia against Kentucky on Saturday. That'll be good stuff. I'm going to shout out a Georgia player on the show today that I probably don't think has gotten enough credit. We'll take a brief moment to do that here coming up in just a little bit too. But off the top of the program, I'm actually going to try to look behind the scenes here just a bit at the Georgia Tech rivalry and why I don't think you have to have too much concern about Georgia looking past Tech in this instance, that the private, behind closed doors conversation is probably a little bit different than you might think, even though publicly you're not exactly stoking the flames of the rivalry publicly. That is certainly true. And I'm going to use an example from Nick Saban's coaching past as a way to cement this point even more. And all of this makes sense when we do it. So we think it's going to be a really good show. We are really happy to have you with us for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Dial 678-ESOG now for a solution to your foundation and waterproofing problems.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
There was something I was thinking about a little earlier today, which is if you ever call something a great rivalry, if so-and-so fan says, hey, our rivalry with blah, blah, blah is a great rivalry, you're kind of making an interesting statement about the rival that you hate. For instance, if an Ohio State fan says, hey, our rivalry with Michigan is a great rivalry, or if an Alabama fan says the Iron Bowl is a great rivalry, in a roundabout way, what you're saying there is that our rival is good enough to help make the rivalry great, because it takes two to tango, as the saying goes here, that a rivalry can't really be one-sided. So if a rivalry is great, then both sides are doing their part to contribute to making it a great rivalry. And I think that's an interesting thing to consider as Georgia gets ready to take on its in-state rival, Georgia Tech, on Saturday. And I really have never really considered Georgia Tech, the rivalry known as clean, old-fashioned hate, to be a great rivalry. Now, it may be an important rivalry, and certainly from a Georgia perspective, it's a historic rivalry. And throughout the week here on the show, we'll talk more about, I guess, the history of it and how it's understood by the coaches and players who participate in this game on Saturday. But do I think of it as a great rivalry? No. In fact, I would go so far as to say this, that the mission of Georgia in my lifetime is to make sure that the Georgia Tech rivalry isn't great, because the times in which this rivalry has sort of felt like at its greatest, at its sort of apex, those were times in which Georgia wasn't quite good enough to assert a level of dominance over Georgia Tech. You think about like 98, 99, 2000. That's a stretch when Georgia Tech was beating Georgia 3 years in a row. Clean, old-fashioned hate as a rivalry probably felt greater and more significant then than it ever had before. But was that a good thing for Georgia? I would say probably not. And for those of you who kind of remember the way old days, back when like Theron Sapp was getting his number retired at Georgia because he was breaking the drought of, 7 straight wins for Tech that led to the 7 or 8. I forget. I apologize for not knowing specifically. But those long losing streaks with the rivalry maybe seemed great back then, but the rivalry being great wasn't great for Georgia, because a great rivalry means you got 2 formidable foes on each side here, and Georgia has worked very hard this century and very hard in my lifetime to make sure Tech wasn't formidable enough to make the rivalry great. So that's kind of the backdrop for Georgia and Georgia Tech here on Saturday. And yet, with me saying all of that, just because I don't think it's a great rivalry, just because I believe it ought to be Georgia's mission to make sure this isn't a great rivalry, that doesn't mean that Georgia isn't motivated for the rivalry game. I'm going to talk a little bit about this, about how, once again, you see a little bit of an example here of what Georgia's saying publicly and maybe what Georgia says privately being very, very different. I'm going to try to give you some specific, tangible examples of how that's true. And if you're a UGA fan, to be completely honest here, knowing that you probably do want to beat up on your in-state foe, or you just want to win every game you play, and you got the SEC championship coming up next Saturday. You might be thinking, well, it's tempting to look ahead on all of this, and you might be thinking it's tempting to look past Tech because, after all, they've been kind of lowly Georgia Tech now for a few years, and yet quietly this year they're playing a little bit better with interim coach Brent Key. You might be a little nervous about some of that. And some of the things that some Georgia players have said this week, that might make you a little nervous too, especially for guys who maybe because they didn't grow up really following college football or they didn't grow up in this area, that maybe they don't have the understanding of what clean, old-fashioned hate used to be about, what it should be about, what it is about. You might be kind of left to think, oh, gosh, I'm getting a little nervous here because Georgia's not exactly fanning the flames of this rivalry publicly. In fact, let me give you an example here. So Jamon Dumas-Johnson grew up in kind of the Midway, Maryland area, and, Mid-Atlantic is what I meant to say. They're kind of like that Mid-Atlantic region up there. And obviously, up there, they're not talking about Georgia Tech very much. And Jamon Dumas-Johnson sort of admitted that, hey, coming down here to play at Georgia, he had sort of a lot to learn about what the rivalry known as clean, old-fashioned hate between Georgia and Georgia Tech, what that means to people down here. This is what Jamon Dumas-Johnson said about that earlier this week.
I knew in the 90s it was kind of back and forth. But lately, been all Georgia winning the rivalry so far. That's all I know pretty much about the rivalry. I just know when Coach Mark first came here, we lost. And kind of during his era, he most likely lost to him.
So, if you're the television network televising this game, I don't believe you're going to get much from that quote to, hype up the game. Hey, this thing used to be big in the 90s. I'm not quite so sure that, sort of sets the stage for what's going to happen here. And, there's a level of, I guess, subdued emotion there from Jamon Dumas-Johnson. You're sort of like, well, gosh, is Georgia ready for this? Or is Georgia plugged in and ready to do what needs to be done on Saturday? You got the player here from, kind of outside of our state, outside of our region, and he's maybe not even quite so sure, there's much of a rivalry, to all of this. And, Jack Leslie, the kicker who spoke this week, kind of the same thing for him of, hey, I had to be kind of educated about, why this rivalry matters. Here's Podlesny kind of talking more about that himself.
Growing up, I didn't watch much football. Wasn't really growing up on it. I just knew that there's always that, the clean passion, old hate, or whatever the saying is for it. And knowing that there's always, disgust or whatever you may want to call it between the two schools, and that the rivalry was a hard-fought battle between teams, and it always will be, no matter what.
I mean, calling it clean, what do you call it? Clean fashion, old hate. I mean, that's once again one of those deals where it's like, are we really sure that this team is understanding what this rivalry is all about? But here's what I'm here to tell you, and I feel quite confident saying this. This is another example of something that Georgia does all the time. They do this all the time, and frankly, Kirby Smart does this, I would think, really, really well, is that Georgia kind of has this outward exterior where every game is always the same, and everything is just the next game and whatever else. And then privately, the emotional level that's discussed is far, far different. And we don't have to look very far to see examples of this. Think about the other rivals that Georgia has. And this is actually the truth, is that Georgia is a unique program because it does have a lot of rivals. And that's because, the in-state rival isn't in the SEC. Geographically, Georgia's a big state. You've heard all this before. And depending on where you live, the game against Auburn might matter to you more. The game against, in some cases, if you live over in Augusta, the South Carolina game matters to you a bunch. Historically, you think about the rivalry with Florida. You have all of this stuff that's kind of going on. We believe here, obviously, a good Georgia fan is a Gator hater first and foremost, and that's our kind of belief here. But obviously, we also view Tech as a rival, and it's a legitimate foe that Georgia faces each and every season. But the point here is, when you look at the other rivals that Georgia has, you've seen the same example of this year over year. Kirby will act like going into the Florida game, this is just a game, and they're all rivals and whatever else, and yet on the sideline after the game, every kind of sort of moment that gets captured, you see this intense level of emotion, which obviously demonstrates how much the game means. The same thing for Auburn there as well. Kirby will pretend like, it's the farthest thing from his mind or whatever else, and yet how many times snapshots of celebrations after wins or the intensity of the moment during the game where it is quite obvious it means something more to him, and he has put his emotion on display for these players, and now it means more to them because it means something to Kirby. You've seen millions of examples of this. That's something that Kirby Smart does really, really well. They put together this facade of we're all, kind of businesslike, and we don't really use emotion, and yet during the games, after the games, on the sideline, they're clearly driven by that extra level of emotion. They've just kind of figured out a way to push those buttons. They do a really good job with it. And I feel quite confident the same thing's going to be happening on Saturday there as well. And I want to give you an example as to why. You heard Jamon Dumas-Johnson say this a moment ago, that actually, and this is kind of a hard thing to remember back to because it seems like such a long time ago, but Georgia Tech has actually beaten Kirby Smart since Kirby Smart has been head coach at UGA. That seems crazy to think about because Georgia's won the national championship. Georgia's been to the college football playoff twice. Georgia's established itself as a major power in the sport, maybe the supreme power in the sport right now. But back in 2016, in Smart's first year, that's not what things were. Georgia was struggling to find whatever wins it could get, and it kind of gave away a winnable game against Georgia Tech on that particular Saturday. And I think there is something that happens kind of interesting when the failure against Georgia Tech is something that can be discussed in the present tense. It's one thing, as JDJ said a moment ago, Pop as they call him, it's one thing to say, yeah, back in the 90s, this was pretty tough. Like, that doesn't have any tangible meaning to the people in the Georgia football facility right now. As much as I care about the history of this, and Kirby Smart kind of participated in that history, stuff from the 90s isn't motivating anybody to do anything right now. It's just not. We all know that. But when you can say as a coach, and the guys that have also worked with Kirby's assistants, when you can say, hey, a few years ago they beat us. A few years ago this happened to us. All of a sudden that becomes a lot more of a present tense conversation, and that becomes a lot more of a motivating factor. I want to give you an example that proves the point here. There's a guy that we know really well. His name is Mike Johnson. Now, Mike and I used to do a show together called SEC Country Live. Mike is a former Alabama All-American, and Mike was a part of the Alabama team that won the first national championship for Nick Saban back in 2009. So Mike had been there. He was a senior that year, so he had been there for Saban's first year. And you got to realize Kirby Smart's also kind of a part of this too, and he was a part of the kind of building up of what has really become an Alabama dynasty. You have to admit that it has been. He was a part of kind of building all of that up. And so a few years ago on the show, we had Mike talking about, rivalry games like Georgia and Georgia Tech and kind of how these are discussed. And Mike told a great story about how Nick Saban came to view the Iron Bowl differently as Alabama coach because in his first year, Auburn beat Alabama. And that Mike, who's a smart guy and one of the captains, one of the leaders of the Alabama team, kind of saw the evolution of the way in which Nick Saban talked about the Iron Bowl. And I think what Mike said about Saban then is probably also relevant for how Kirby talks about Georgia Tech now. Let me let you hear this. This is from an old episode of DawgNation Daily, and see if you can kind of see the through line here of how a coach kind of changes how he views an opponent when that opponent's actually had some success against him. This is Mike Johnson from a couple of years ago.
That was Nick Saban's first taste of the rivalry, really. So I don't think he understood it. Throughout the week, he kind of explained it to us like, hey, guys, this rivalry means a lot to a lot of people in this state. And it was so funny because when you come back in 2008 and Nick Saban had tasted a little bit of loss on that side of the rivalry, it was almost like he was more irritated. He was like, hey, this game means a lot to everybody in this locker room now. This game, this is a big deal for this football team and for this university and for this athletic department. It was almost like getting a taste of that loss the year before to Tommy Tuberville and company really amped him up to try to go out on a ledge and really develop that team in a way to kind of put Auburn behind us. I think it's different for Kirby Smart. Obviously, he's been a part of that rivalry, so he understands that and maybe a little bit better than most people that are coming from the outside in. And I think that you try to play into the player's psyche when you talk about these rivalry games.
I love that from Mike Johnson. First of all, Mike's a great guy. Some of you know him. He's a great guy. I love that because it's behind the scenes and it's honest. Mike, who watched the evolution of Nick Saban, Alabama, saw him go from a guy who's like, hey, this thing used to be big back in the 90s. Let's care about this right now, to, no, all of a sudden we care about this because of what just happened to us. Tommy Tuberville, as head coach of Auburn, beat Saban in 2007. When they were ready to play in 2008, as Mike Johnson tells it, completely different attitude for Nick Saban. All of a sudden now he's got some emotional investment in this rivalry game. You don't think Kirby Smart feels the same way about Georgia Tech? You don't think Kirby Smart is such an insatiable competitor that he has memories of the fact that he lost to this bunch in 2016? You don't think that drives him? And you don't think these Georgia players are driven by what drives Kirby? Watch the way in which these guys relate to each other all the time, the connection they have. And a lot of the connection that Kirby speaks about is player to player, but a lot of this is shaped by the culture created by the coaches. And if these coaches have the taste of defeat still in their mind, because honestly, and think about it this way, Tech hasn't been to Athens since 2018. So the Georgia Tech win against Georgia in 2016 was 2 home games ago, if you really think about it that way, because they didn't play in 2020. So Georgia won this game in 2018 in Athens, and the previous home game prior to that was the one that Tech won. You don't think that doesn't come up this week? You don't think Del McGee's not talking about that because he was on this staff? Glenn Schumann's not talking about that because he was on this staff. There are people who work with Kirby that experience that themselves. You don't think they're driven and motivated by all of that? I believe they are. I think that's one of the cool things about Georgia. When you have an alumnus as head coach, you do have a special appreciation for rivalries. And when you've tasted defeat in the rivalry, even though losing to Tech in 2016 wasn't a good thing, it becomes the kind of thing that becomes an even more of a galvanizing and motivating force for this team right now. Last week, I told you, I thought Georgia was in kind of a tricky spot, kind of finishing a long, tough stretch of SEC games and being on the road and having it be cold, and I wasn't quite so sure what version of Georgia you'd see there in that spot. I don't feel the same way about Saturday. I feel pretty sure this is going to be a Georgia team highly motivated to come here, finish off the home slate with an undefeated regular season, to smack around an in-state rival, because all of these Georgia folks have an appreciation what the Tech rivalry means. They may not say it publicly, but privately they know that there is no joy to be had by Tech having any reason to feel they're a part of this rivalry whatsoever. Privately, I believe that's what drives this team. I think it's very similar to the evolution that Nick Saban had at Alabama. And I think that could be the fuel that Georgia needs for another big win on Saturday there as well. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and we're happy to have you with us no matter how you get to us today, live on video, 10 a.m., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. We're on the radio at noon on App Sports Radio 960 The Ref. We're available as a podcast wherever you find them. The Apple Player, Spotify, the world-famous DawgNation.com. Lots of ways for you to connect with our broadcast, and we really appreciate you joining us no matter how you get to us today. And a huge thanks to our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia for making it all possible there as well. Raining a little bit as I was driving in here this morning reminds me that for some of you, the presence of rain, the presence of that moisture is the kind of thing that makes you a little bit nervous, because you know when it comes to your basement, your crawl space, your garage, that water's creeping in where it's not supposed to be. You either see the remnants of that, wet spots that have been left behind, or in some cases, maybe even actually standing water right there on the inside. And you know how much damage that has the potential to do to your home over the course of the long haul. Well, that's the reason why you want to reach out to my friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Plus, you got those cracks that you may be seeing in the foundation down in the bottom floor of your house or in the walls, other places. Once again, that's a sign of a potentially serious problem. And that's the kind of thing you want to talk to Engineered Solutions of Georgia about. Now, the good news is they're a solutions-based company. That's really right there in their name. So if it's a simple fix, that's what they want to tell you. They'll give you the instruction you need to kind of take care of that if it's not a big deal. But if it's more substantial than that, if it's a little bit more of a serious issue, well, all the more reason to have ESOG on the job for you, because they've got an entire team of engineers they want to put to work for you to help solve your problem. That is what they're all about. And there's nobody else in our market that can say they have that level of resource to put towards your issue when it comes to foundation waterproofing issues. They're also proud partners of UGA, which is a really good thing. And they're longtime friends of ours here at DawgNation Daily. I am so grateful for our partnership. This time of year, when it comes to Thanksgiving, you're thinking about things that you're thankful for. Hopefully, we're always thinking about that. But this time of year, especially thinking about some of these special relationships. And for us here at DawgNation, our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia certainly count as one of those. So please do me a favor. Give them a call. 678-ESOG now. That's 678-ESOG now. And that'll get you in touch with our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia. All right, coming up in a couple of minutes, we're going to talk to Connor Riley, and we're going to get more into the expectations of the game against Georgia Tech on Saturday, the nature of this rivalry, which is admittedly a little bit more difficult to define in comparison to some of the other rivalries that exist around the SEC and around college football, and a pretty fun preview of the college football playoff top 25, which comes back out tonight. We'll talk more about all of that and how that kind of centers around Georgia at the top of the college football world here for a moment. But before that, though, I want to go around the doghouse. And it's presented today by Georgia's own credit union. And something really occurred to me on Saturday that, and I hate when we do this, but it's probably the kind of thing that we do from time to time, that I think there is a Georgia player that we're not giving enough credit to. And if anything, it sort of speaks to the success that he has, that we've maybe overlooked him as much as we do because you just sort of take it as a given. But on Saturday, it should not have been taken as a given. Georgia got a big performance on Saturday from kicker Jack Podlesny. They got a really, really solid game from him. And I know Kirby talked about this in his post-game press conference on Saturday, and we all kind of feel the same way, is that when you see the field goal kicker trotting out there, there's an element of that sort of feels like bad news because you are, as the saying goes, settling for a field goal. And you hate that for Podlesny because he's really good at his job, and yet when he's doing his job, that sort of means that the team that you love has kind of failed at what their first job was, which was to score a touchdown. You like to see Pod on the extra points, the field goal, and you're kind of not always super thrilled about all of that. But on Saturday, the 9 points that he gave Georgia very early here, these were crucial scores for the Dogs at a time in which points were very hard to come by. You know, on Kentucky's first drive, on a fourth down situation, they chose to go for it, and I think their concern about how the win would impact their kicker is one of the reasons they made that decision. Late in the game, their kicker also missed a field goal as well. So Georgia got the big performance from Podlesny on Saturday. Admittedly, we don't talk much about the kicker around here. That's no disrespect to Hot Pod. It's just, kind of we sort of spend more time focused on other things. But on Saturday, you were once again reminded of how good it is to have a good one. So in light of all of that, here is Jack Podlesny kind of talking about his own thought process of what it's like kicking in extreme weather conditions, very cold, very windy like it was on Saturday. And there's way more that goes into this than you might realize, and Podlesny talked about some of that on Saturday. Here is Hot Pod.
At the end of the day, I'd like to think it's a 70% mindset thing, 30% conditions. You've got to go out there and you do your job, whether that means aiming outside of the field goal post for the wind to take it back in, whether it means alternative kicks, you have to go deep right, you have to go sky right, deep left, total mindset thing, but also, it's fun when you get to face adversity and do different things.
So I told you yesterday that I really believe that Georgia's number one competitor for a national championship, the number one obstacle that's standing in UGA's way, is not any single opponent. It's not any other team that's out there. There's no behemoth that you try to avoid because you can't win the national championship. You have to play so-and-so. That's not what Georgia's story's about. The real competitor that stands in the way of Georgia, and make no mistake about this, this is a formidable foe. The real competitor that stands in Georgia's way is just the full weight of the grind and the fact that you're asked to do this well 15 times and that any slip-up can prove fatal to your championship chances. And so, therefore, if you want to be best positioned to handle the grind, you have to kind of bulletproof yourself. You have to kind of fully insure yourself against anything that could go wrong. And a lot of this is about the way in which the team kind of approaches all of this with a team-first mindset and its physical and mental toughness and everything else. But there are also these other procedural things that can trip you up there as well. And we know this in college football. It's the old meme of, college kickers, you never know what's going to happen with a college kicker. Kickers can be erratic. Kickers can be hard to predict. Kickers this, kickers that. We all understand that if Georgia wants to really bulletproof its championship chances as well as possible, a really dependable and sound kicker is obviously a big part of that. And you don't want to settle for field goals. But there is a moment in which you're going to have to try them. And Georgia won't play in weather conditions again this season, thankfully, the likes of which it faced last Saturday at Kentucky. But nonetheless, the mental fortitude to say, okay, what does this wind mean for me, and how do I change my kick because of this? And the fact that Podlesny, in his own words right there, says, I embrace this. It's actually kind of fun to feel this adversity. It's fun to feel this challenge. He didn't say this, but you could almost interpret his words as, it's kind of fun to be one of the main guys here for a change. And I'm always kind of standing over here on the periphery while everybody else is talking about everybody else. DawgNation Daily never mentions my name, but on a day like this, when there's very few points to be scored, all of a sudden you care about your kicker again. Well, yeah, in a roundabout way, I guess that kind of is true. And you better believe there could be a moment here late this year, once again, where Podlesny's name, boom, emerges quite as a central figure in terms of just how good Georgia can be. And at that moment, you'll once again be very thankful to have a kicker like Podlesny, who has very quietly gone about his work, very quietly gotten the job done for UGA. He's having a very good season. He is a very, very good kicker, and Georgia is very lucky to have him. I thought it might be appropriate for us to at least spend a couple of minutes pointing out just how true that is. That is Around the Doghouse. It's presented today by our friends at Georgia's own credit union. Here's something else we're lucky to have right now, especially this time of year as you're traveling around to watch these dogs play, as you're shopping and getting stocked up for the big meal coming up this week, or all the gifts that you're buying for the Christmas season that's coming up after that, or the holiday season as you like to enjoy it. As you're doing all of that, those Visa Signature and Platinum cards from Georgia's own credit union, a great way to buy the things that you're doing right now, the purchases you're already making, and get a whole lot more from that as you go through all of that. Because the Visa Signature and Platinum cards come with Flex Rewards, can really be used for about anything. Gift cards, cash back, travel, merchandise, so much more. You can also earn up to $150 when you open a new Platinum or Signature card. And there are some restrictions that apply, so make sure you check out georgiasown.org for more details on that. It's georgiasown.org for more details on that. All right, so we have a very busy show for you here today. Before it's all said and done, we're going to talk to former Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm. We'll ask Jake about his feelings with the rivalry with Georgia Tech. Jake's a good one for this because he's played in the game, had success against Georgia Tech, but he also grew up in the state of Georgia, so his appreciation for clean, old-fashioned hate might be a little bit different. And we may even kind of get into privately how Kirby kind of talks about some of these rivalry games. You sort of get the impression that privately it's a little different than it kind of sometimes is publicly, and that's probably a good thing as it relates to UGA. So we'll cover all of that here today, and we'll get you ready for some of these coaching rumors that are out there. Kind of a wild exchange on social media last night with Lane Kiffin and a reporter. We'll kind of get into that before we're done today there as well. But for now, Dogs getting ready for the in-state rival, moving past the SEC slate after a remarkable run there in conference. CFP Top 25 coming back out tonight. Let's cover all of that here with Connor Riley on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia right now.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Oh, we'll talk to Connor Riley here right now. And Connor, there's so much I want to get into with you, but let me, I guess, begin by kind of going backwards here for a moment. I think that there's an element in which what Georgia did on Saturday, I don't just mean beating Kentucky, I mean finishing off another slate of SEC games with an undefeated record. This isn't as easy as Georgia made it look. In fact, one of the things we made a big deal on the show last week was it had been 2 years since any team in conference had won as a visitor on consecutive weeks in SEC play. Not to say that the fact that Georgia's now gone undefeated in conference for 2 seasons in a row. If this were easier to do, there'd be more teams that did these kinds of things. What do you think of Georgia, kind of where it stands after it finishes up another SEC season with once again another undefeated mark?
Yeah, it speaks to where this program is right now. And because I wrote about this on Sunday. When everyone was looking at the Georgia schedule in the offseason, everyone had circled this 4-game stretch that they had just gone through and said, well, if Georgia's going to lose a game, it's going to come in that stretch. Some people circled Tennessee. Some people said it was Kentucky because it was the second of 2 games on the road, and it was going to be a physical contest, and it absolutely was on Saturday. Some circled the Mississippi State game, coming off an emotional Tennessee game. Georgia won all of them by double digits. And yes, the score was 16-6 on Saturday, but I don't think the game was ever as close as that score indicated. And if Georgia's able to get 1 yard they need at the end of the third quarter or the beginning of the fourth quarter, it's a 23-0 game that looks and feels very, very different. And so it speaks to the level at which Georgia is operating at right now, where they're just, it doesn't matter the opponent. They know they are better, and they go out there more often than not and just out-execute you there as well. And, Georgia gets compared a lot to Alabama for a number of reasons, but it's telling that, to me at least, in the past decade, as Alabama has built up this dynasty that they have become, they never went 8-0 in back-to-back seasons. They only did it those first 2 years under Saban in 2008 and 2009, and they didn't win the national title in 2008. And so for Kirby Smart to get this program to this point, obviously there's still more work to be done. They know that. That's why they're not exactly celebrating this accomplishment to the manner which I think maybe some other schools would be. You look across the conference, you see Florida lose to Vanderbilt. You see Tennessee lose and get blown out by South Carolina. That hasn't happened to Georgia in these last 2 seasons, and it speaks to the team culture as a whole that even though they lose so many guys from last season, this machine keeps chugging right along.
So I think you say a lot of interesting things there, and I'm trying to process how I feel about all of this. And I guess I'd sort of say it this way, and I've talked about this certainly last week leading into the Kentucky game and the reaction to that win this past Saturday. Speaking as a fan here for a moment, there is no game that Georgia could play the rest of the way that would make me very nervous, and yet I sort of find myself as a fan who wants Georgia to win, I sort of find myself at least a little bit nervous about every game, because the real issue here that I think that Georgia's confronting is the grind. It's the challenge of doing this 15 times. It's the challenge of doing this for a second consecutive season. And the weight of that just gets really pretty heavy, because if you care about point spreads and things like that, Georgia isn't necessarily that much bigger of a point spread favor at Kentucky on Saturday than it will be in some of the college football playoff games. It has the potential of playing. So you sort of get the idea here that there isn't one opponent that sort of stands there as the obvious nemesis that could prevent Georgia from winning the national championship. But when you think about the old theory of so-and-so team against the field, it's really the field that poses an issue here. And I think that's what kind of the Kentucky game kind of reminded me of a bit here is that every game provides its own unique challenge, no matter what you may think about that particular team, because it's just kind of hard to show up and play at an excellent level each and every Saturday, which is what winning a national championship kind of requires.
Yeah, there's a reason going back, I think, to the 1940s. It's only happened 5 times in college football where a team has gone back-to-back and won national titles in that manner. While Georgia is absolutely going to go for 2 in 2022,
there you go.
It's just really hard to replicate that level of success, not just across 15 weeks, but across 30 over 2 seasons when, for the most part, these are, 18 to 22-year-olds who aren't always going to be at their best. Jamon Dumas-Johnson, as I've got a story coming here shortly, admits he hasn't been playing at his highest level in recent weeks. And he knows he's got to fix that, especially with, SEC championship college football playoff games coming up. It's really hard, especially as a young person, to replicate success on a day-in, day-out basis. I believe Kirby Smart mentioned that going in the run-up to last week in terms of, he talked a little bit about being uncomfortable, but the bigger thing that I think is the challenge is just how do you replicate success every single day? Georgia has found a way to do that, and that's going to get tougher in the coming weeks given the opponents that the Bulldogs are going to face. But for you to do that 2 straight years in the SEC and consistently find success and do it every single day, again, it speaks to where the culture of this program is, because they don't have a Kobe Dean or a Jordan Davis out there this year. They have a Jamon Dumas-Johnson and a Jalen Carter out there. And, at some point those guys are going to go off to the NFL as well. And then you're going to be looking at a Raylan Wilson and Jamal Jarrett as those sort of guys there on that defense that are upholding that standard. And on the offensive side of the ball, it will be a Carson Beck, a Gunnar Stockton, a Roderick Robinson, those types of players upholding that standard. And it speaks to the culture that starts from recruiting and is carried out throughout their careers to when they play the last home game in Sanford Stadium on Saturday and Senior Day.
I want to talk about Georgia Tech here for a moment, and you're a really big proponent of this rivalry, more so even than I am, even though I'm probably in most areas more of a traditionalist than you are. When it comes to the Georgia Tech rivalry, you seem to kind of value that tradition a little bit more than I would say that I do. What do you think of the current state of the Georgia Tech rivalry? And I'm asking this in the context of what you heard from Georgia players this week, what you've heard from Kirby Smart this week. What do you think of the current state of clean old-fashioned hate as it actually shifts back to Athens for the first time since 2018?
Yeah, I think this rivalry has been done unimaginable harm by the hiring of Jeff Collins. You look at where this rivalry was, and it was a legitimate rivalry when Paul Johnson was there. There was a disdain for Georgia Tech. There was a disdain for the triple option. It was bred throughout practice in the course of the season. I think I can speak during my time in college. The 2014 loss to Georgia Tech is one of the more frustrating results of the past decade for Georgia football. The 2016 loss was not a good loss either. And the hiring of Jeff Collins, and this is sort of the crux of my story, just sapped everything sort of out of this rivalry. The 2 times that he got to coach against Georgia, his team lost 97-7. It's a big reason why I think he got fired this season, and you have seen Brent Key come in there and bring at least a level of respectability back to Georgia Tech, and where, I give them a lot of credit. They have nice wins over Pitt, Duke, and North Carolina this season. They're playing for a bowl game, which I don't think anyone who watched this team in September thought was going to be a possibility when they came to Athens at the end of the season. And Tech, after this, and again, I don't expect them to win. I expect it to be another big Georgia win. If you're a Georgia fan that wants to see this rivalry, have some intensity, have some passion, like I do, because this rivalry, being an Metro Atlanta area kid, having friends on both sides of this rivalry, you need Georgia Tech to at least get this head coaching hire right. They got it. They could not have gotten it more wrong with Jeff Collins. And that, in my opinion, has really hurt the rivalry. There's not, from a Georgia side, the same level of intensity that you see even for, say, Tennessee right now. And, I went up and looked this up. Georgia Tech has a more recent win over Georgia than Tennessee does, but Tennessee came into this year's game ranked number 1 in the country. The last time Georgia Tech was ranked in a poll at all was back in 2015. And so you need Tech, again, I don't necessarily know that you need them to be world beaters. I think you've seen, Auburn is an intense rivalry, Florida is an intense rivalry, while those programs have had their ups and downs in recent years. But you need them to at least be respectable. I give Brent Key a lot of credit in getting Georgia Tech back to being respectable. But this program, if you want this rivalry to matter in the way some of the other ones do in the SEC, you need them to get this head coaching hire correct.
I think there's a weird thing that goes on here with this too, and I think a lot of what you're saying is pretty interesting. We obviously kind of made our case before you join us about why maybe privately Georgia talks a little bit differently about this game than it does kind of publicly, because that's just kind of what Georgia does when it comes to stuff like this. But the other part of this is it's now become kind of a regular occurrence for Georgia to play Tech and then play the SEC championship game the following Saturday. And like sort of football 101 would say, oh, well, you're tempted to look past this to get to that. And yet, if anything, I think the presence of the SEC championship game, the idea that Georgia does have so much more to play for, in a weird way becomes a motivating force in a game like this, because Georgia wants to make sure it handles its business, gets it over with so it can get ready for that. I mean, I think the team is probably thrilled this game's at noon, chomping at the bit to play it, get it over with, and then get sort of focusing on what kind of comes after that. That, in this entire time that Georgia's been kind of winning the East with regularity, playing in the SEC championship, you really haven't seen them show any signs of looking past Tech, because if anything, it's just kind of the thing that a locked-in team does. They just sort of stay locked in. It's kind of like the actor who kind of is a method actor. They just sort of stay in character. Georgia doesn't really ever get out of character, and so they're locked in for a game like this because they're just locked in this time of year.
Right. You think back to, say, even like and again, obviously Mark Richt era, a different time, and that Georgia Tech team was actually pretty good. But you look back to that 2014 team, they had a chance to go to the SEC championship game, had Missouri lost on a Friday to Arkansas. Missouri wins that game, and I think Georgia came out that Saturday and didn't play its best ever because it didn't necessarily know what it was playing for, what it was going to continue to play for. And because they lost that game, instead of going to play in, say, the Orange Bowl or an Eater Six Bowl, I believe they end up going to play in Jacksonville or in Tampa, and really change the way I think that 2014 team ended up being viewing, because you look at some of the numbers on the spreadsheets. That was a really talented team, and they did not necessarily live up to it. And that loss to Georgia Tech plays a big reason why we view that 2014 team in the manner in which it does. And they went and played in the Belk Bowl there, as I now remember. Nick Chubb ran for a gazillion yards. But I think, now under Kirby Smart, again, now that you're playing for an SEC championship, as they've done in 5 of the last 6 seasons under him, this Georgia Tech game, it helps that Georgia Tech has taken a step down. And I do understand how some view this as just a scrimmage and a tune-up. But it helps demonstrate where this program is to bring this conversation full circle, that they don't just treat this game as a walkover. They know, hey, we have to be at our best and get right going into the SEC championship game. Go out there, take care of business, get up big early, and then get ready for LSU. Because I even think you look back and say the 2019 game, while, yes, that was a 52-7 final score, Georgia was messing around with Georgia Tech there, and they paid the consequences in that SEC championship game against LSU. DeAndre Swift picks up an injury in that game, and then George Pickens famously gets thrown out for fighting in the third quarter. And so I think that 2019 game sort of shows the importance of, hey, yes, it's a rivalry game, and yes, maybe Georgia Tech isn't on the caliber of Georgia's level. But if you go out there and you mess around, you're going to pay the consequences of it, because it is a very meaningful game to Georgia Tech still. It is their Super Bowl, and I think Georgia knows and understands that, and it shows how buttoned up this team needs to be to take care of business on Saturday.
I want to ask you about the CFP rankings coming out tonight. Before that, let me remind folks really quickly that if you're a Georgia fan stretched across the country, it's amazing how many folks we have tuned in here. They're listening other countries around the world, across the country here right now, and you want to stay connected to your alma mater, the university that you love, as Georgia goes through this very special time of year as it tries to go for 2-22 and chase another championship. The UGA Alumni Association can be a great resource for you to stay connected to your dogs and find out where other dogs just like you or maybe near you there as well. The website to go to is alumni.uga.edu. That's alumni.uga.edu. There are potentially game watching parties near you. They're places where you can kind of call the dogs with people just like yourself who love the University of Georgia just like you do. You can also connect with some special online products as well, like digital downloads, exclusive video content, and you can even get some special swag that's specifically associated with the UGA Alumni Association. The UGA Alumni Association exists to make sure that dogs never have to bark alone, and you can use the website as a way of staying connected and connecting even deeper with the alma mater that you love. It's alumni.uga.edu. That's the website, alumni.uga.edu, for more on the University of Georgia's Alumni Association. Connor, CFP Top 25 coming out again tonight. Georgia, very little drama. Below that, potentially a pretty good bit of drama, obviously, with the leading into rivalry weekend coming up this week, too. I guess give me like a 1 or 2 sentence takeaway here about what you expect to see when the top 25 comes back out tonight.
I think USC is going to jump LSU and get into that number 5 spot and further confirm, I think, this idea that USC does control its own playoff destiny as it should if they beat Notre Dame this week, something I don't personally think they're going to do. If they win the Pac-12 as a one-loss champion, I think they're going to get in the playoff. Again, I don't think that's going to happen, but the possibility exists for it to do so. I'm also really interested in what happens with Clemson. They blew out Miami, took care of business this past weekend. They're playing a South Carolina team that just blew the doors off of Tennessee, and they get a game potentially against a ranked North Carolina team, assuming they beat NC State, which I don't think we can assume after what happened against Georgia Tech this weekend. But I do still think there is a path forward for Clemson. I do think Clemson is going to win both the ACC championship and beat South Carolina this season. And while everyone has written Clemson off, I think there is still a very real path to the playoff for them, especially with Tennessee now losing. Even though I thought Clemson, a one-loss ACC champion, would have gotten in over Tennessee, now that is absolutely going to happen. And so if Clemson is able to successfully jump Alabama this week and the committee puts them above Alabama, I do think that is sort of signaling to people once again, hey, this is a Clemson team that still has a real shot of getting into the playoff. But if they keep them behind Alabama, I wonder if maybe that committee is the committee potentially signaling, hey, even though this Clemson team, only lost one game this season, what we have seen from their body of work is not enough to get them into the playoff. And so I think USC jumping LSU and where Clemson ends up being ranked are the two things that I am at least looking for as to see who I think will be the number 4 team in the college football playoff and ultimately play Georgia in Atlanta in the Peach Bowl on December 31st.
We're going to have a Go for 2 and 22 video special tonight looking at this college football playoff top 25. Connor's going to be a part of that, so we'll look forward to talking to him more about that then. Connor, thanks for joining us today, though, on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We'll also look forward to more conversation with you from Athens there and what's happening with these dogs, and back here on our show again very soon as well.
Yep, as always, it was a pleasure, man.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So great stuff there with Connor Riley. We'll also in a few minutes here catch up with former Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm. We'll talk to him more about the game coming up on Saturday and that Georgia Tech rivalry. We'll get a lot more of that here coming up in a moment. But before that, though, we want to go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And one of our video commenters asked me today, hey, BA, you got that Royal Caribbean cruise coming up? You better believe we do. Great chance to be on Wonder of the Seas here coming up very soon, something I am very, very excited about. And coming up later on February, taking the whole family on a cruise vacation. Just really looking forward to, hopefully after Go for 2 and 22 is kind of all said and done, that championship celebration is ongoing. We'll do it in style on board a Royal Caribbean cruise ship, and we invite you to also be a part of that with us there as well. On the DawgNation cruise coming up this April 24th to 28th. You've been hearing me talk about that a lot. You can go to royaldogs.com. That is royaldogs.com to find out more about this big, big event. Jessica Slater is a great travel agent, and she has made the website for you to get all the information that you need on that. And so you can read the website, find out about the details, the special DawgNation events, the stuff that's fun to do on board Independence of the Seas. And if you want to contact Jessica directly, you can do so at 770-718-9147. And that's 770-718-9147. Cannot wait to have all of you on board the second ever cruise with DawgNation coming up this April. All right, we're going to get ready to go cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean right now. And you heard Connor say this about the college football playoff top 25. I do think that some of what Connor said there is probably true. I mean, I think there's a motivation for USC. You've heard this before, that you haven't had a Pac-12 team in the playoffs since 2016. So if there's a way to find an avenue for USC, of course the playoff committee wants to pursue that. And frankly, right now, USC's winning the kinds of games that give them more cachet with this committee. Winning on the road at UCLA was a pretty big deal for USC and their first-year coach, Lincoln Riley. And I told you this last week, that for whatever you want to say about Riley when he's been in the playoff, lost to Georgia in 2017, blown out in 2018, blown out again in 2019, that his record in the playoff has not been good. But his ability to get to the playoff, having to go on long winning streaks after losses in both 2017, 2018, and 2019, Riley's shown an ability to do that. I would not count him out being able to do that with USC right now, even though the challenge is certainly a formidable one, facing a Notre Dame team that's playing better football and a potential Pac-12 matchup where the Trojans won't be a very big favorite in that game, if favored at all. It's not an easy path for USC here, but it's the kind of path that a coach like Riley has navigated before. So I think that USC will be a big part of the college football playoff top 25 story here tonight. I think that LSU kind of remains hanging on here, but I don't think there's a whole lot of appetite for a two-loss team in the college football playoff if there are other available options. For instance, like the one thing I don't think you'll see is any kind of evaluation where a two-loss LSU makes it over a team that only has one loss that has its own strong case to make. So the loser of Michigan-Ohio State, I would say, is probably better positioned for a playoff run, an appearance in the playoff than LSU would be, because they would simply have one fewer loss. And we also said this on last week's show, that when it comes to Clemson, is that we thought, based on where Clemson was ranked last week and based on the fact that NC State was in the top 25, that UNC, at least prior to its loss to Georgia Tech, had a pretty high ranking there too, that this committee was showing a little bit of a nod in the direction of reserving the right to still include Clemson in the playoff conversation. Even though they really hadn't been included in that discussion by anybody else, we thought that where Clemson was last week, not too low to still get in this thing. And I think that same thing remains true here right now. CFP Top 25 does come out again tonight. We'll have a Go for 2 and 22 video special tonight, looking at those contenders for Georgia with this national championship race. We'll do that for you on video tonight when the college football playoff top 25 is announced. There was great drama on social media last night, by the way, as a reporter close to the Mississippi State program, or should say just close to the state of Mississippi in general, came out with what he was describing as confirmation of the rumors that Lane Kiffin's taking the Auburn job. Let me kind of walk through this on social media last night. John Sokoloff's a reporter. He comes on Twitter to say, breaking, Ole Miss coach Lane Kiffin plans to step down as the Rebels coach Friday and head to Auburn to become the Tigers' next coach, according to sources. Sources say the Tigers haven't officially offered the job to anyone yet, so Lane to Auburn is happening story soon. Now, we see this sometimes when it comes to reports. I don't know what John's sourcing is on this. Maybe he has it locked down, but, sometimes people kind of get out ahead of themselves on a story they think is eventually going to be true. We don't really know what was actually happening on this, but we do know this, is that Lane Kiffin jumped into the fray on this very quickly in the direction of Sokoloff saying, of the John Sokoloff tweet, "That's news to me, John. Nice sources," and he gives a string of emojis there. So Lane Kiffin basically responded to this directly, accusing of Sokoloff of having the story wrong and not having it right, and kind of making up his sources or whatever it was that Lane Kiffin was saying. And then Kiffin wasn't done. Another tweet later on where he says, and he kind of makes up this news story. This just in, breaking news, John Sokoloff, that was the original reporter of WCBIN News in Starkville, Mississippi, plans to step down as lead anchor and head to WLOX to become their new lead anchor, which I'm assuming must be another TV station. Sources say WLOX hasn't offered the job to anybody yet. So John to WLOX is happening story soon. So basically, Lane Kiffin is making fun of the template for the story that the original reporter put out there. And then one more from Lane Kiffin, the popular meme where like the guy's like posing in front of the tombstone. Somebody put that on Twitter of John Sokoloff in his career, and then Lane Kiffin came back and kind of laughed at that. So Kiffin makes a big deal on this on Twitter last night, but the one thing that you don't hear at any point in time Kiffin saying here is that he's not going to Auburn. But what you do hear, though, is that Auburn hasn't offered the job to anybody yet. So here's what you've got. You got the situation where the Egg Bowl is on Thursday, the Iron Bowl is on Saturday. The assumption that I'm making here, and other people online are also saying this, is that Auburn doesn't want to do anything right now to take away from Cadillac Williams coaching in the Iron Bowl on Saturday. But pretty clearly they know they have to act as quickly as they can to hire their next head coach. I do believe they'd probably like for it to be Kiffin, but they have not offered him yet. I think that Kiffin wants the Auburn job there as well, even though he kind of postures here on social media. He never denies interest in all of this. So it's going to hang over the Egg Bowl on Thursday. It's going to hang over the Iron Bowl on Saturday. And then maybe when these games are concluded, we see pretty quick movement on this. But certainly Lane Kiffin having some fun last night with that on social media will make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger, we'll have a Kroger Fresh Take right now with the great former Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm, who's good enough to join us here on DawgNation Daily today. Jake, thanks so much for your time. We appreciate you being here. We hope you're getting ready for at least some Thanksgiving. I know you're busy with a lot of stuff going on, but maybe some time with family there as well. So thanks for being a part of what we're doing here today.
Hey, Brandon, what's going on? Thank you for having me. Happy Thanksgiving week. Rivalry weekend in college football, so big, exciting week. Let's go.
No doubt about that. And I'm curious, as somebody who grew up in Georgia, who participated in this Georgia-Georgia Tech rivalry 3 times, winning, of course, all 3 of your games there, I'm curious, what does the Georgia-Georgia Tech rivalry mean to you, Jake?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good one. It's nitty-gritty. At this point in the season, both of the fields are just a mess. They're torn up from the season. It's just a physical football game. They want to beat us. We want to beat them. And really, it's just take care of business in your home state, the pride that goes with it, and being able to talk about this game for the rest of the year and be able to have bragging rights.
Let me be really candid here for a moment. I think there are some Georgia fans that sometimes get a little concerned about this because, A, maybe they have an appreciation for the history of this rivalry, and they sort of see a situation right now where Georgia as a program is way up here, Tech as a program is kind of the opposite direction, although they have played better with Brent Key as their interim coach. And sometimes there's a little bit of a concern on the part of some fans about a misalignment of, I guess, motivation, where like maybe they feel like, well, Tech's got huge motivation here because, they feel like they're the little brother in the rivalry. Georgia may be concerned about looking past because the SEC championship looms and the chance to win another national championship. Like the one thing I sort of always say back in response to that is that no matter what Georgia says publicly, privately, they always seem to be pretty locked in for these rivalry games. The teams that you played on much the same way, making a big deal out of beating Auburn, about beating Florida, and about beating Georgia Tech as well. What is it behind closed doors like when you're getting ready for a game like this, and just how intense is Kirby as an alumnus, a graduate of Georgia, for these kinds of rivalry games?
Yeah, well, Kirby's going to be very intense about this week because, I promise he still has a sour taste in his mouth after his first year as a head coach and losing to them at home. And, that's something that still just, that they think about, that comes back. And, nobody wants that situation to happen again. And moving forward, everything is in front of the Dogs and what they want to accomplish the rest of the season, and they got to take care of business this week. And it could absolutely make Georgia Tech's season be a finishing touch on their season, and really make it. If they could just mess us up, that's what they dream for, that's what they live for. It's just about not letting it happen.
So when you go back and look at last Saturday's game against Kentucky, as a quarterback, you understand this. We talked about this. When you're trying to play in those cold weather conditions, something you've experienced in the NFL now, and something that a version of that Stetson Bennett experienced against Kentucky. As a player yourself, what kind of appreciation did you have for what Georgia did against a physical team on the road like that? I can tell you, having been there, it was freezing cold. What's it like to play in games like that, and how proud were you of Georgia for kind of coming through a game like that, emerging as a winner?
Yeah, in games like that, and this late in the season, it's just finding a way to win. Let's not take for granted of what they've done this season. They are whatever and 0 versus the SEC, whatever and 0 against the SEC East, a perfect season in the SEC. We cannot take that stuff for granted of what they've accomplished this year and going back to last year. So huge accomplishment there. It is not easy, and especially at this point in the season, it's just about surviving, finding a way to win. That's one thing we can say about this team. As in different games, they've found a way to win. They've done it in different ways. They've been physical, running the football. They've thrown the football. They've relied on their defense a lot of times. I mean, they found a way to win, and that's what I'm proud of these guys for. This late in the season, man, let's just move on to the next one. We got so much ahead of us, but we can't look ahead and not take care of business this week.
And I think you maybe as well as anybody can understand that, because you go back and look at some of the teams you played on at Georgia, these were among the very best teams in the country. You know, you came within an eyelash winning the national championship in 2017, and yet going undefeated, even when you have that level of team, it's just still a really hard thing to do. Going undefeated in SEC play is just a really hard thing to do. Like, you know, you yourself may have as much of an appreciation of that as anybody does, because you played on some really good teams and you know how hard it is to kind of get all 12 of those wins, or in SEC play, all 8 of those wins. And to now think, Jake, that Georgia's done that in SEC play 2 years in a row and has a chance on Saturday for 2 consecutive regular seasons to be able to do that there as well. I mean, I just think that maybe you almost have had to have been through it to understand that it's just not nearly as easy as this team has made it look.
No, the focus and the discipline it takes week in and week out is so underappreciated. Yes, their season is not quite as long as the NFL season, but, I mean, to go 12 weeks, to go 13 weeks, and to not lose a football game, man, that is so ridiculously hard to do. The amount of focus, the attention to detail it takes week in and week out. And we're talking about young men, too. We're not talking about grown men who are 30, 35 years old. We're talking about young men who have all the distractions in the world at their disposal, and they're coming in week and week out to go to work and to win football games for the guy sitting next to them. So that is a huge accomplishment. Let's not take this for granted of what they're doing, and hopefully they finish it out this weekend. And we can look across to everywhere else in college football. It was a crazy week last
That's
weekend.
Right.
Some teams, somehow scratched through and won, like TCU in Michigan, and then other teams were not so lucky. And so, man, it's just college football. It's what it is. And, man, just kudos to these young men for being able to do what they're doing.
I want to talk to you more about kind of what this weekend's going to be like here in a moment. Before that, though, let me remind folks, this is our Curter Fresh Take with former Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm here on DawgNation Daily here today. And obviously this time of year, when you're thinking about having enough money for the holidays and the things you want to do with family and friends, any way you can save money is obviously going to be a great thing, and that's where Kroger steps in here. They offer you great savings going on at the fuel pump right now, because you're going to get 4 times the fuel points on your gift card purchases and your digital coupons at Kroger right now. By the way, those gift cards become great holiday gifts in their own right, and as you're purchasing those and using those digital coupons, you're also going to get 4 times the fuel points right now. That goes all the way through December 6th, so make sure you enjoy that right now at your local Kroger. So, Jake, we talked before about you being busy this time of year, the team being busy. I know even going back to your high school career, it was always like the old adage in high school football that you always wanted to earn the right to be practicing on Thanksgiving. So there's an element in which, you know, the Thanksgiving holiday almost gets trampled by the football season, especially if you're good enough to have, you know, games that matter late in the year. So kind of put me in the position of being a Georgia football player here for a moment. You know, you got a regular season finale on Saturday. You're kind of beaten up and a little bit tired, and you got family and friends kind of pulling you in the direction there on Thanksgiving. How much of that do these players get a chance to sort of step away on Thursday for? Do they get time with family and friends? What is Thanksgiving Day like for these Georgia players here this week?
Yeah, man, it's a fun time. I always remember it's a fun practice that morning. They get out pretty early around lunchtime to be able to go to wherever they need to go for Thanksgiving. The coaches do a fantastic job of just rounding up guys who, you know, live a little bit farther away than some other guys do. But, man, it's a great time to be with your friends, be with your family, spend some time together. I think Kirby, the way he does the schedule is great. It's always a cool practice. And you mentioned it, and it got me kind of reminiscent on the glory days back in high school of practicing on Thanksgiving. That's such a big deal, such a fun time. And, you know, sadly, I haven't been able to spend the time with my family as I would have liked to these past couple Thanksgivings because of football. But, man, you're earning it right. It's fun. And you don't get to do this very often either. But, man, there's so many things to be thankful for. And what a great time of the year.
Let me just finish with this really quickly. How much then, understanding that this team's been through a lot, this is a busy week, how much do you think this team's going to benefit from being back at home on Saturday and finally hearing, now they've had good crowd support in both Kentucky and Mississippi State. There's been a lot of Georgia fans traveling, but that's still not the same thing as kind of being back between the hedges for the first time since that great win against Tennessee. How much do you think this team has a chance to feed off its own home crowd on Saturday, being back there, being in that environment for a tired team that's kind of probably looking forward to getting ready to make a run for the postseason? How much can they get a lift from these home fans on Saturday, you think?
I think that is a great point. I think that is huge to come back at home. They haven't had that many home games this year. Yes, the Tennessee game was huge, astronomical home game, one for the ages. But I will think it'll be a great pick-me-up going into the SEC championship to feed off the energy of the home crowd. And honestly, get in, play the game, and then go home and get some rest, too. Moving on this week, late in the year, bodies are banged up, and I think it'll be good just honestly for everybody's health, mental, physical, spiritual health, going into the next week after that. So excited for these boys, excited for the home crowd, too, to get to see the Dogs play. Man, it's going to be a great week.
Well, Jake, I know you haven't experienced very many normal Thanksgivings in quite a while, but you've certainly given us a lot of enjoyment over the years as you've been getting ready for games we've all enjoyed watching. So we are grateful for you, very thankful for your participation in our show here on DawgNation Daily, and our friends at Kroger, I know, feel the same way about that. So thanks for being here. Hope you can get a chance to enjoy some time here this holiday season, and we're looking forward to getting a chance to talk to you soon.
Yes, sir, Brandon. Thank you.
Great stuff there from the former Georgia quarterback, Jake Fromm. And it's interesting to kind of get that perspective and that story and all of this, because it is really tricky being a player this time of year, because you still got mamas and daddies, and you still got brothers and sisters, and you still got grandparents, you still got all of that, and they want some of your time, and you want to give that time to them there as well. And so you're trying to figure out a way to do all of that, and these coaches understand this too, is that, hey, you got to grind towards winning a championship, but you can't grind too hard because you grind somebody down to a nub when you do that. So Jake used the phrase spiritual health a moment ago. There is a certain level of the success formula that kind of does, I think, involve a little bit of a sort of spiritual health and making sure you're kind of keeping it fueled in the right way. And that's not, there's no like specific like linear formula to follow to make sure you do that. You just sort of have to have an understanding of kind of a emotional IQ about all of that. And so the job of being a coach this time of year, I'm sure, is not easy, and it's interesting to hear Jake Fromm talk about all of that. Let me do a couple of things before we get ready to say goodbye to you. First of all, speaking of getting ready for Saturday, obviously our injury report, a big part of that. And if you watch our Kroger kickoff on Saturdays, the folks that bring us that injury report, as they have all year long, have been our friends at the Durham Law Group. Now, speaking of the Durham Law Group, if you've been hurt or injured in an accident yourself, you've got your own injury that you're worried about, well, you want some retribution. You want to be made right in all of that. And so that's where the Durham Law Group can step in here. They don't just practice personal injury law, they define it. That means there's no fees, there's no expenses unless you win. That's the commitment they want to make to you, is that they want to have the same kind of vested interest in the outcome that you do. And that's what they're all about there. So you can give them a call, 844-4GA-HURT. That's 844-4GA-HURT, or you can find them online at georgiahurt.com. That is georgiahurt.com. Now, one more thing before we say goodbye to you. So we are coming down to the wire on our Go for 2 in 22 kickoff celebration next Saturday. We have got so much stuff going on here with this. I want to make sure you understand all of that. So tonight we're live on video, Go for 2 in 22, looking ahead to the College Football Playoff Top 25. Actually, we're looking back on the Top 25 that's just announced, but looking ahead to what that means for Georgia in its pursuit of a second consecutive national championship. And then next week, on the other side of the clean old-fashioned hay, on the other side of Thanksgiving, we are in Go for 2 in 22 season. And we've got a massive tailgate celebration there at the Home Depot backyard right next to Mercedes-Benz Stadium on the Saturday of the game. That's 3 hours prior to kickoff. Obviously, open bar, the food, all the entertainment, a special second-generation DawgNation Go for 2 in 22 t-shirt. This is a new design. We obviously have a great design right now in our DawgNation store, and we have a new design coming up for you for this. Now, we have made this commitment that the first 200 people to sign up for the Go for 2 in 22 kickoff celebration tailgate will get a Go for 2 in 22 t-shirt. So we're also coming up to the end of that 200. So I'm not quite so sure where we are on that, but I do know it is limited. And this is not one of those things where like sort of like the typical like advertisement puffery. I'm telling you, there's only so much food to go around. There's only so much open bar space to go around. There are only so many T-shirts that we're able to print for this. So we got 200 of them, and we're about to sell through all of these. We knew it would. These things always go so fast. So please go to DawgNation.com. There's the top of the page. Click the link there, and you can find out more about the Go for 2 in 22 kickoff event. You can get your ticket to be a part of it, and you can secure one of those really cool second-generation Go for 2 in 22 T-shirts. You can get one of those and be a part of that today. Now, one more thing before we sign off here today. We also have a big event next Wednesday, Marlowe's in Brookhaven. That's another Go for 2 in 22 live broadcast, but it's also going to be a special live event that we want you to be a part of, starting at 6 p.m., previewing the SEC Championship game at the Marlowe's in Brookhaven. That's 3575 Durden Drive right there in Brookhaven. Once again, 3575 Durden Drive. Already hearing from a lot of folks who plan on being there. We want to see you there as well. The entire team from DawgNation going to be on hand for that. Lots of maybe special guests too. So it's going to be a blast, going to be a lot of fun. We want you to be a part of it. That's the big Go for 2 in 22 event next week at the Marlowe's in Brookhaven. It starts at 6 p.m. We can't wait to see you there. So a lot of fun to be a Georgia fan these days. Clean old-fashioned hate on Saturday. Go for 2 in 22 in full effect after that. All kinds of plans being made for where you might be going for the playoff or what you might be doing if you're lucky enough to get to the national championship. Let me tell you who's not doing any of that right now. It's the Tennessee Vols. And so many of you are still having a great time with Tennessee after their embarrassing loss to South Carolina on Saturday. So a lot of our golden shoe stuff here is in kind of a look back on some of that. And in fact, let me show you this one here. And I kind of cut his name off, and I apologize, but Dylan Hand sent this to me. Josh Heupel saying, we're going to be at the SEC Championship game. And then Kirby Smart saying back in response to that, yep, Section 27, Row 13. That's pretty funny stuff from Dylan Hand, who sent that to me on Twitter, which I love to see. So Go for 2 in 22. It's a lot of fun right now to think about where Georgia is. And if you've been hearing those Vols fans talking trash all year, a lot of fun to think about where they ain't. And that's a great time. And by the way, speaking of Georgia rivals that wear orange, how about those lousy, stinking Gators? When the hay is in the barn for this season, when Go for 2 in 22 is complete, you start thinking about next year, and you start thinking about 340 days being right back in Jacksonville, beating up on Florida again. That is our Gator Hater countdown. We are Go for 2 in 22. We'll see you tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And on video. Time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews on all of that. We're going to get your comments and kind of roll through a very busy show today with a lot of your comments. We'll take them on Facebook, on YouTube, DawgNation.com, and everything else. In fact, let me pop over to Facebook to begin our proceedings here today. Now, yesterday we went to darn near 10 till. We ain't doing that today, y'all. We got so much stuff to do. So we're going to be a little quicker with all of that today. But hopefully still getting the job done. Hopefully still taking care of business as we should as part of our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. Craig Jones says Mark safe from any more Tennessee neutral site discussions. Yeah. All of a sudden, the list of teams that Tennessee hopes to play on a neutral site starting to get longer and longer after a while. Graham Nicholson talking about transfers that have more than just 1 year development is crucial. That's true. By the way, we're also getting ready for like the craziest transfer portal thing ever, probably coming up in a few days. Joseph Kennedy says Lane Kiffin got his tail kicked in by Sam Pittman. Yeah, it's not a good look. I mean, I think if you're Ole Miss, you deserve better than this, to have your coach kind of dancing around and playing with another SEC job on social media, making a big show out of, calling on a reporter, but not outright denying you're taking the Auburn job. You can't help but notice that. And pretty clearly, this looked like a pretty distracted coach in the game against Arkansas this past week. And by the way, for a lot of these coaches who've been hopeful to maybe jump to bigger and better jobs, we have Liberty's lost down the stretch. Ole Miss has lost a couple times now down the stretch. A lot of these coaches who are looking for bigger and better jobs, they haven't exactly been performing very well down the stretch here. Fair enough to point out here. Alan Vrabanchik also pointing out that Gator fans thought that Florida was going to go 8-4, 9-2. Yeah, they're a little disappointed right now there as well. Philip Jordan Wells tying a little long drink into the cool down, which I think is great. Chad Williams says, I wouldn't be surprised if Texas, as he calls them, Texas A&M beats LSU. I mean, here's the thing. Like, I've sort of lost any credibility to predict anything good for Texas A&M because every time I've tried to, I've ended up being wrong. I don't mind being honest with you all about that. That's obviously true. But I sort of get the point that you're making. At least this is, I think, what the point you're making is. I mean, is Jimbo Fisher going to really go out without a fight for the entirety of this season? Like, the entirety of this season? Is that going to really happen? There were some people on the LSU side of this who thought they might have some issues last week with UAB. By appearances, they didn't. I didn't see any of the game, but it doesn't seem like they had any issues whatsoever. But this is not an LSU team that's been, necessarily throttling people all year long. So, I mean, it sort of seems like it wouldn't be the craziest thing ever. But gosh, I mean, ATM, as you call them, they haven't shown any signs of life at all. They scored 20 points or something against UMass last week. Like, I just think it's amazing just how little fight Texas A&M seems to have in them. Craig Jones says Lane Kiffin's not maturing along with his age. Glad he's not on our team. Too much about him. Yeah, I'm not a Lane Kiffin fan. I don't mind telling you that. And, you say he's not maturing with his age. I think he's matured probably some. I think he's more mature now than he used to be. I don't know him personally, of course, but I don't think I've ever even met him. But by appearances, it seems like he may have matured some, but not matured enough for my taste. For instance, there have been some chatter last couple of weeks of, would Lane Kiffin pass on the chance to be at Auburn because he's going to follow up Nick Saban at Alabama? Saban and Kiffin are seemingly pretty close, that Saban might vouch for Kiffin to get the Alabama job if Saban wanted to step down. Like, to me, Lane Kiffin just doesn't seem serious enough for the Alabama job. He just doesn't. And, he's had success at Ole Miss. They've won games at a rate in which Ole Miss typically has not done. So you've got to at least give him credit for that. But there's a part of this Kiffin story that, I don't know, it just sort of leaves a little something to be desired for me. He just doesn't come across as presidential enough for an SEC coach in my mind. Joel Moody says, have you considered the fact that Georgia could possibly be the only team from the South in the college football playoff? Yeah, there's a strong possibility that could be the case, and that would be different than normal because you wouldn't have that second SEC team like Alabama. Both times Georgia's made the playoff, Alabama's also made that same years too. And, obviously, Clemson's been kind of a fixture here. There's a chance they don't make it there as well. I still think that Clemson is a possibility here. So, I would say that if USC keeps winning, they're going to be in. I would say that if TCU's undefeated, they have to be in. I don't think the committee necessarily wants them to be in, but I think they would have to be in. The winner of the Michigan-Ohio State game is definitely going to get in. So let's start talking about some of the potential chaos. USC is not going to necessarily have an easy cakewalk through its next two games. What happens if they lose? Well, Clemson's definitely back a big part of the story then. And the loser of the Michigan-Ohio State game is definitely a big part of the story at that point there as well. So a TCU loss opens the door for that. A USC loss opens the door for that. I guess you could say, well, what if the right teams lose? Could a 12-1 TCU team still make the playoff? Maybe so. But, boy, I just don't know that there's a lot of appetite for that. I think they would rather have a team like Clemson with one loss in as opposed to a team like TCU. But I don't know how you sell Clemson over TCU, knowing that TCU at that point would really have the better resume, I believe. They would have to sort of retrofit the Clemson resume to make Clemson more justifiable at that point. Joseph Kennedy says, I hope that Moose State beats Ole Miss. I mean, I'll just tell you this. The Egg Bowl is one of my favorite games. And my son was even the other day, he's like, hey, we're going to get to watch Egg Bowl on Thursday night, which, yeah, I mean, nothing better than have a little dessert, a little Thanksgiving dessert, settling in to watch a little Egg Bowl. I just love it. I really do. Love it. Nick Roundtree says he thinks that Michigan beats Ohio State. Nick, there are people who are making that prediction. There are. I don't believe I think that, but there are people who are making that prediction for sure. For sure. Let's get some more comments here. Let me go to DawgNation.com for a moment. Mike Goignier says, I'm not sure that TCU or USC survives unbeaten the remainder of their games. That's a fair prediction, Mike. It really is. Yard Dog also thinking that LSU might have some trouble against Texas A&M. An interesting prediction. Interesting prediction. DT says ATM, this is what they're calling Texas A&M, has a really bad culture problem, just like Florida State in the Jimbo's final years. It does seem somewhat similar. I mean, and I don't think that's too strong of a word, that culturally something just seems to be really, really off right now. I think that's all really fair. I do. J Bob says it's going to be one interesting football weekend coming up, and you are right about that. DT says the CFP committee has a proud history of retrofitting their rationale. Yeah, I think you're right about that too. Frank, going back to the old school days of the clean old-fashioned hate rivalry, one of my favorite memories was the drive in 1971. Andy Johnson drove UGA 65 yards with about a minute and a half left for the winning touchdown with just seconds left. A crucial 4th and 18 completion was tight end Mike Green that was clutch. So, Frank, I'm glad to have you telling stories like that on our show, and I'll tell you that my involvement in the Georgia High School Football Hall of Fame as one of the board members, it has given me a better appreciation for some of the guys who I'm too young to have ever seen play. And Andy Johnson's career took place before I was born. But when you read about the success that he had at Athens High School, eventually going to the University of Georgia, and obviously I was a little bit more familiar with his time at UGA. I don't have, the recollection ability of the 71 game like you do. But I was talking to Tony Barnhart the other day about the 1971 season. He was telling me a couple of things about the 71 season. And so, I'm not smart enough to be a historian, but I do have an appreciation for history, and I think that's great. And, learning more recently about, what a great quarterback Andy Johnson was, I just really, really am thankful that people are able to tell us those stories and help us to connect that way. I think that's great. Sequoia Dog says you can find the 71 game on YouTube. That's actually really good to know. That's a fun thing to go back and rewatch. That's really cool. Thank you. I appreciate that, Sequoia. Scott Harris says, I've gone to a Tech game on Thanksgiving Day. Turkey, dressing, bourbon, and Coke. That's pretty great right there. That's a pretty good Thanksgiving, I would say. Pretty good Thanksgiving indeed. Yeah. So in my lifetime, the only time I remember Georgia and Georgia Tech playing actually on Thanksgiving Day was 1995. Am I wrong about that? Is there another game in my lifetime that was actually on Thanksgiving? Because my first memory, my first memory of Georgia Tech was not good. When I was in the third grade, this would have been 85, I guess. This would have been 1985. Tech beat Georgia in Atlanta. And I just remember being mortified that Georgia Tech had beaten Georgia. And actually, I guess they'd beaten them 2 years in a row because they beat them in 84 too, although I did not remember that game. But I just remember being mortified by that. And I remember going to the Georgia Tech game in 1986, and what I kind of viewed as a big revenge game. And Georgia got their revenge against Tech in 86. So that's about the time in which my memory of Georgia Tech, it sort of dates back to watching on TV in 85 in Atlanta, being in the building in 86 in Athens, remember that. And the only time I remember, my memory might be failing me, the only time I remember the game being on Thanksgiving was 95. Wasn't one of those 90s games that Zaire played in? Wasn't that a Friday? Like the one that Zaire got hurt in and then Mike Bobo came in. Was that a Friday? Was that a Black Friday game for Georgia and Georgia Tech? Maybe that was the case. Scott Harris says 95 sounds about right. Yeah, that's the game that Hines Ward played quarterback. DT also remembers the JV game. Yeah, so that was always a big deal. My family, I think my grandfather used to go to that. So, like in my lifetime, that was called the JV game. But what it used to be was the freshman game, because for a long time, some of y'all know this, freshmen were not eligible to play at the varsity level. And so you had like the freshman game on Thanksgiving Day, and it benefited, as you said, Scottish Rite. I think that was it benefited Scottish Rite. And so it was always in Atlanta. It was never in Athens. I believe it was always in Atlanta. That was on Thanksgiving Day, the freshman game, and it was a huge deal. Some of y'all may have more memories of this. But the way my grandfather and my dad used to tell this to me was, you'd have 40-something thousand people. I mean, first of all, you couldn't get 40-something thousand people at Bobby Dodd Stadium now to save your life. But back then, you'd get this huge crowd to watch the Georgia Tech freshman game. And then eventually it became the JV game. And it wasn't nearly as big then. They tried to maintain the tradition. But, freshmen were playing, on the regular team by that point in time. But when the freshmen were ineligible, when they were only playing in like this Thursday game, it was massive deal. People from where I live would talk about going to the varsity and go to the game, going to the varsity for, get some food, then going over to see the freshman game. That's a massive deal. Dogs on Top says, I took a current member of the Georgia General Assembly to the UGA game in 1995 on Thanksgiving Day. Says the day was better than the game. I can only imagine some of those stories for sure. Tom Cox says that he was at the 1971 Classic Georgia Tech game. He says, my buddy and I gave up and left just before the Andy Johnson moment. So you had major hype around the Georgia-Auburn game in 71 that year, too. Now, Georgia did not beat Auburn. That's back when Pat Sullivan was the Auburn quarterback, and he kind of used that game as a springboard to win the Heisman Trophy. So you had some classic games back there in 1971. Let me go to a YouTube here for a moment. Somebody was mentioning, who was said this? J-Bob on the subject of Georgia Tech and Colorado splitting the national championship in 1990. So in my I would have been like, I guess it's been my middle school or high school, because when I was a kid, 8th grade, went to high school. So I used to have a 1990 Colorado National Champions T-shirt that I used to wear to school sometimes, because when you're a kid, that's just what you do. All right, let's see what else. I guess we got a spammer back over here on the YouTube side of things. Some of y'all got your search history getting us in trouble again. Kirby's belt on the subject of Gunnar Stockton. Yeah, he does kind of look like a little bit of a throwback, doesn't he? That's right. Matt Presley says the Dogs blacking out versus Georgia Tech. I'd love to see either black or the all-red uniforms the recruits get to show off. Yeah, I don't think they're going to, but I wish they sort of would. I've said before, I wish they'd just sort of pick a date on the calendar, and I think that senior day would be a fine day to do this, and just wear some crazy uniform that day. I think that'd be a great thing to do. DMart42 says, what's the Thanksgiving spread like at the Adams household? So we go to my mom's on Thursday night, and she cooks a great meal, and we'll spend some time with my wife's family throughout the day there as well. And obviously, even though it's been a couple of years, we still have, incredibly, sad memories about, my dad not being there, of course, like that. But my mom has done a great job of making Thanksgiving a very special thing. And we have the turkey and we have the ham, and I'm, as you might guess, I'm very big in the starchy vegetables, or not vegetables, like the starchy sides. I want the mashed potatoes with the gravy. I want the, or just mashed potatoes in general. I want the corn. I want the macaroni and cheese. And I really like a dry macaroni and cheese. Some macaroni and cheese for me is just too wet. I want there to be a little bit of a dryness to it, which I always kind of appreciate. I really like old school dressing too. I just like that a lot there as well. So there are a lot of very starchy sides for me, but my mom always does a great job of doing that. She cooks the same dressing that my grandmother made, kind of a peanut butter pie type dessert thing that my grandmother also kind of made famous there too. So does a great job with that. We love Thanksgiving, and I've always loved Thanksgiving. I loved it when I was a kid, and now my kids love Thanksgiving too, which is kind of nice to see, because Thanksgiving's, you don't get presents and stuff like that. And so, you kind of wonder, what do kids think about all this? But my kids love Thanksgiving, so I love that. Kirby's Belt says overbaked mac and cheese. I guess that's kind of what it is that I don't want it to be wet and gooey, which is what some people want it to be. I want it to be, pretty dry. That's kind of what I want it to be. Carter Evans says, I found an original 1980 Coke bottle in my basement yesterday. However, I also found an original specialty Coke bottle from the 80s with the Auburn memorabilia on it. Should I trash this? Seems like voodoo. Well, I don't know you trash it. You can you probably put that thing on eBay and get a few dollars for it. And listen, how a man, lines his wallet's no business of mine. So while you may not want to display the Auburn Coke bottle, nothing wrong with you making a few dollars from somebody else who might want to display it for themselves. Nothing wrong with that at all. DMart42 says, got some 1980 Coke bottles sitting next to my 2021. Yeah, I sort of thought about this, that I might bring a 1980 and put it next to this 2021. I told you my boss didn't want the desk getting overrun with stuff, but maybe a little 1980 bottle next to the 2021 wouldn't get me in trouble. You Fall Get Up says that Kirby can talk up any opponent. Listen to him talking about tag. You would think this weekend is a bowl game, and that's true. Kirby kind of has the sort of general respect for everybody card that he plays in these press conferences. But privately, I think there's something different than that. Privately, I think this is a Georgia team that's really driven by the desire to go out and win a rivalry game. And very interesting, by the way, you heard Jake Fromm echoing exactly what we said off the top of the program. And Jake, he's 1,000 miles from here. He wasn't listening to us to begin the show. But Jake said, hey, Kirby has extra motivation with this game because he has lost to Tech as a coach, and that still kind of drives him here. So we talked about that earlier at the top of the show, and Jake Fromm kind of echoed that himself. I thought that worked out pretty well. Let's see what else. Oh, Baggins and Friends says, I didn't even know this exists. He said, I've got a complete six-pack of 1980 Coke bottles in the carton. That's amazing. Is the carton, the casing that it came in, is it branded in any way? Because that's really cool. I also remember this, is that, and some of y'all may know more about this than I do, is that there was a 1980 Coke tray, like a Coca-Cola branded tray that was supposedly worth more than the Coke bottles were because they printed there's so many 1980 Coke bottles. They just printed as many of those and shipped and bottled as many of those as they could. But the tray was a little more, I guess, scarce. And so I remember that kind of being a thing back when I was a kid. Let's see what else. Thomas Van Santa says that he still has his 96 Rock license plate. So 96 Rock was a rock station, radio station, back when I was a kid. Or not even, a lot of people know what it was. It's been gone now for a while. It's amazing how many of these these car tags I still see. It's amazing. In fact, you almost see more of those old school 96 Rock tags than you see of anything else. And not even current radio stations. I'm not quite sure what that means, but it's funny that you bring this up because I feel like I've been seeing a lot of these lately. Buddy Lee Z says, do you think we'll ever have a Heisman winner under Kirby Smart since he doesn't care about points and numbers and things like that? I mean, it is harder for a guy to win the Heisman playing at Georgia. I think that's the case. But remember, for a long time, Alabama never had a Heisman Trophy winner either. When Mark Ingram won the Heisman Trophy, that's the first Heisman winner in Bama history. So, and since then they've had Ingram, they've had Derrick Henry, they've had Bryce Young, they've had Devontae Smith, that even though that Georgia kind of has a little bit of an ensemble cast in terms of how it uses its players, if Georgia keeps playing kind of this elite top-end national level, I think that also creates some Heisman opportunities for players too. So I think eventually the status as a perennial national championship contender could actually work out well for Georgia, even though they don't quite, have the individual leading star player in kind of the same way. Kirby's Belt says, I could care less about the Heisman. I get that. I mean, I would say that I probably a few years ago kind of felt that way. And I mean, if a Georgia player is not involved, I don't care at all. But if a Georgia player had a chance to be a Heisman finalist, I guess I probably do care more about that. I mean, there was a time a few years ago when I would have said, absolutely, I don't care the first thing about the Heisman Trophy. I probably would have said that. But I'm probably more interested in it now than I used to be. I don't know why I've kind of circled back around on the Heisman. I mean, first of all, it is an iconic trophy, first of all. I mean, you got to admit that. On the list of, iconic trophies, you got to say Heisman's right there on that. It's certainly different in terms of the way it's discussed than, a traditional pro sports MVP or something along those lines. And the fact that Georgia players are now, even if they're not making the finalist list quite often, they're still kind of mentioned in contention for the award. I think that's actually kind of gotten me slightly more interested in it than I was at one point. Badisi Bulldog, and I hope I pronounced that. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It's not Badisi. It's Bud Ice Bulldog. Sorry about that, Bud. Excuse me, I cracked myself up on that. Bud Ice Bulldog says, imagine Munson calling our field goals versus Kentucky last Saturday. The wind is swirling. I know I don't do a good impression, but the wind is swirling from all different directions like a hurricane. They can't decide which way to blow. It has to be perfect. That's about what he would say, Bud Ice. You're right about that. You're right about that. Budisi, I called him to begin with. Alan Hampton checks in to say the Heisman lost its luster when Christian McCaffrey didn't win it. Maybe that's the case. Carter Evans wondering if LSU will travel big. I imagine they probably will. for the SEC championship. They haven't been there in a couple of years. DMart42 says he thinks that Michael Mayer from Notre Dame is going to win the Heisman. I don't know about that. Foster Moss says from now on, the Florida football game is going to be aired on the History Channel. That's really funny. That's good stuff. Spencer Clark says the great Larry Muntz, there is nobody like him. Nobody like him at all. A true one of a kind. All right, final comments. Miriam Corbin, thanks for the kind words. Barry Watkins, you as well. Thank you very much. Lucy Bowers-Boykins, thanks to you there too. Earl Smith says Kentucky has my respect for the way they played us. I don't think there's any doubt that Kirby respects Mark Stoops. Kirby says he respects everybody, but I believe he actually really does respect Mark Stoops. I don't think there's any doubt about that. DawgNation.com, final comments. Randy Hall says I could have used the chortle button. Yeah, I need the old school. Radio stations have like the radio on, the cough button, the things like that. We're a little bit different design here. We don't quite have that set up, but that was one where I could have used a cough button to be sure. Let's get some final comments. Frank, going back to the 1990 Colorado National Championship, yes, they did get 5 downs. So Colorado won against Missouri when they scored a touchdown on what the officials called 4th down, but was technically a 5th down. Can you imagine if that happened today? Like, it was a huge deal in 1990, and as I say a lot of times, I'm actually not quite so sure where it was a huge deal because we didn't have social media and message boards. I'm not sure where all the arguing about this took place, but I remember this being so controversial, and in Tech's defense, it should be controversial. They really did get a 5th down against Missouri. This is back in the old Big A days. So I guess Colorado went 10-1-1. In addition to the game they won because of a 5th down, they ended up tying somebody, and I forget who that was, and they lost a game there as well. So somehow that was good enough to win the national championship. Tech won its bowl game against Nebraska. Nebraska had lost, and supposedly that was its national championship ticket by beating Nebraska in the Citrus Bowl. Nebraska had lost its previous game to Oklahoma like 45-10 or something like that. They had tied North Carolina. They had won every game, but tied against UNC. I think it was UNC. So these are the two teams that split the national championship. I actually remember thinking that it was Miami that should have been the national champion in 1990. That was my sort of hot take at the time, going around the halls at school, just sort of yammering to anybody who would listen. That was my hot take at the time. It's really Miami that probably should have been the national champion. But yeah, so 10-1-1 Colorado and 11-1 Georgia Tech, who beat Averages Grits Nebraska in the Citrus Bowl. Those were the two national champions that year. This was not a golden age for college football. This was not a golden age. All right, final comments. Let's see what else. Jacob O'Neill, thanks for being here. Nick Roundtree says it's confirmed that Jasper Sanks was down. Yeah, that's another one. If the Jasper Sanks fumble, which was total anarchy, it was like the purge. So they ruled that Sanks fumbled, and yet the Tech player that picked it up just walked into the end zone with it and just stood there. Even if it was a fumble, the Tech player who picked it up, you could have tackled him in the end zone, but the whole thing was just total anarchy. It's terrible, terrible call against Georgia in a 1999 game that I'll always remember. Wild game. Georgia lost in overtime there in Atlanta on a truly horrendous call. Truly horrendous call. For sure. Nick Roundtree says what propelled Georgia Tech in 1990 was the win over Virginia, who was number 1 at the time. That's true. Virginia finished about 8-4, but they did beat Virginia when they were number 1, and I do remember that being a big deal. I do. How about A.J. Ferraro? Got gifted an SEC championship ticket by my father-in-law. Boy, did I marry into the right family. You really did, A.J. That's great. Barry asked about the schedule for the rest of the week. So we're live tomorrow like normal. There's no show at all on Thursday. and we're going to be pre-recorded on Friday. But we're going to have a really good show for Friday. So that's the case on that. Then obviously the following week, go for 2-22, getting started with the SEC Championship. We are heavy in all of that then. So we have a lot of fun stuff coming up. So the only day this week we don't have a show will be Thursday. We'll let you spend some time with your family, but we'll see you back here for a pre-recorded show on Friday. Then I'm going to go ahead and get you primed for this. The week after the SEC Championship game, things are going to be a little bit weird. We're going to have a show every day, but it's going to be a little bit weird, and it just sort of can't be helped. So we'll tell you more about that then. But for now, thanks for being here for our RS Andrews Cooling. Y'all check out the AJC online, ajc.com. All kinds of big news here around when it comes to the AJC on all of that. Obviously getting ready for the senatorial runoff. That's a very big deal here right now. So you got a lot of stuff going on with that that's worth paying attention to. Also, do you ever watch that show? It was on USA called Crisley Knows Best. Well, those folks are going to prison. Todd and Julie Crisley are going to prison because they didn't pay their taxes. Y'all, you better pay your taxes because they're going to jail. Also, I told you before, if you want to get intel on Georgia Tech, AJC's got plenty of that for you here right now. Hawks, I guess, lost the Cleveland Cavaliers. So, also, all kinds of fun stuff coming up for the holidays, too. Christmas and whatnot. You can find that online, ajc.com there, too. Also, there's a big, big subscription push coming for the AJC there as well. You can get more information on that. We'll be looking forward to telling you about that. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow, 9:45 for our first and 15. 10 a.m. after that for DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then, everybody.